So just as by way of welcome, there are a lot of people have been very worried about the divisions in America, the polarization, the potential for violence. There's been a tremendous amount of discussion about it and about what's driving this phenomenon and whether we have a good national preparedness response or even way of dealing with these issues. That's really the subject of this morning's conversation. Our panelists have been asked to each offer two or three of their favorite ideas of what would be kind of practical initiatives that could be taken. We're accepting the fact that there is quite a bit of division in America and it needs to be addressed. So they may take on that issue somewhat, but we're not going to spend as much time on that as we are on just hearing their ideas. Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation yesterday wrapped up the day's sessions with a wonderful discussion with Uzra. And he basically said that to deal with this division and the undermining of our democratic system, we're going to have to be intentional and vigilant. And the threats that he was most worried about, I think, are good ones for us to start with today, which basically that there are threats to our democratic society and our values, and they start with the growing income inequality, with the monetizing of hate and division, and the distortion of capitalism for the few. That's what he offered, and that's fine. I mean, you will have your own reasons as well. So many are concerned, and obviously the recent election highlighted these splits. There's the radical violence. The threat of radical violence does loom. And our panel today is just going to offer their ideas. So we're going to go in this order. I'm not going to introduce people more formally because you have their bios and can really look everybody up quite nicely. And they've got great bios. Almost all of them have authored at least one book. I did have a chance to read some of Hamse's book last night, which Amazon gives us a good preview of. And I've looked at George's before and reviewed Carrie's. And I'm sorry, Prabha, that I've not read any of your books, but I would recommend them highly. And Hamse's book is titled "America, Here I Come," so with a long subtitle, which we all have to do. But Hamse, great to have you with us. Thank you for your public service. And why don't we just get us off to this espresso shot of the day, this Ignite session, if you would. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Good morning. I first want to thank Alliance for Peacebuilding again for convening another amazing and incredible peace conference with folks who know inside out ways that our country and our world can get more peaceful. So very grateful for the opportunity. I want to first start off with, just maybe what you just share about, addressing income inequalities. I think what I want to highlight is that, we are here with these, divisions in part because we have not systemically addressed the deficits that led to where we are. And for me, this comes economic justice. So when we talk about, the whole discussion about criminal justice reform, important aspect of that has to be economic development and job creation. And I say that as a leader for workforce development in the state of Minnesota. And I thought I knew something about conflict drivers and all of that prior to coming to this role 2 years ago. But as I drove around, across 87 counties in the state of Minnesota, where I feel like we are a microcosm of what's happening in the country, I really become a student, and so I think addressing the deficits and systemic, barriers that lead people to, feel their dignity has been taken away from them is a major conflict driver that needs to be addressed. The second is, folks who, are not embracing, the significant demographic changes that are happening in our country. I mean, the fact that, one of the examples that I would like to share is I went to this small county, small town in rural Minnesota, and as I went there, people were asking me, what I was doing there, and I said I'm the deputy commissioner. I lead the workforce system for the state, and they were really shocked that this 19-year-old looking Black Muslim immigrant is now leading the state's workforce system. And quite frankly, some of the structures and systems that we have in place, including our workforce development fund, was established in 1980s when the demographics, were drastically different. The way people consume content and services was different, and we still have the same systems in place. And in 1980, I had no idea where Minnesota was, and now so. I think addressing both the deficits, but also addressing the narrative, the challenge of the narrative, in that more inclusive, equitable economy does not mean folks getting disintermediated. So I think, to me, those two, addressing systemic deficits, that prevent people from prosperity, and addressing the challenge of the narrative, are two areas that is on top of my list as it relates to reducing polarization.
Thank you, Hamse. Could you give us just one example of something in the economic justice, an initiative in the economic justice space that you feel might be that we might expand upon or adopt as a country, that is still fairly rare, but you believe in?
Yeah, sure. So the example I will give is, here we have what's called workforce development fund. So these are the resources that allow people to get training for jobs and increased income. The structure of the program now leads to 82% of the participants to be white male. And if these funds were meant to address, those with the greatest needs, the systems that are in place do not align with the workforce needs of today. Whether it's the populations, 70% of our population growth in the next 2 decades will be coming from communities of color. Yet we have systems in place that where most of the resources go to folks who have the least needs, and so if the fund, is fund beneficiaries are 82% white male, but yet we know those who are disproportionately impacted by lack of family sustaining income as being, Black and brown people. It's a major issue. It creates tension. It creates, it takes dignity away from people. So that's one example of, without addressing systemically, aligning, power and resources with where, our more inclusive, diverse needs and populations exist, we're going to have some problems.
Thanks very much, Hamse, for this good start. Carrie, why don't we turn to you? I know your remarks may be more around the election, I understand.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was going to talk about polarization as it showed up in the election. So I work for AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, and 2 years ago, we published a study called Shared Security, Shared Elections, where we looked at election violence around the world. Why does it happen, and what are best practices to prevent it? So I've spent 20 years doing peacebuilding and political work, a lot of it overseas. And I think international peacebuilders were surprised in the past 2 years for the first time to be seeing the same signs of potential election violence in the United States that we work to prevent in countries around the world. So we've identified 5 signs in our study that could signal that election violence was possible. And those 5 signs were politics based on patronage and weak electoral management, ongoing division and conflict, repression of opposition, or a violent repression of protesters, and lack of multi-party effort to maintain and protect election integrity. So I think that, in reflecting on those 5 points, we've seen signs that we had and have potential for violence in the United States around this election. There was a lot of dialogue in progressive circles around coup prevention. I'm so many of you followed that up until the election. And that did not happen, thankfully. We are at an interesting point, though, moving forward. So we know that Joe Biden will become the president on January 20th, though there has not been an official concession, but still in November, 79% of Trump voters believed that the election was rigged. And today, 62% still today believe that the election was fraudulent, though there's no evidence of any fraudulent activity. So this leads to us, for the peace builders, for people in politics that are joining this call, this is really an existential moment, I think, for America, where we have to look at how do we address the division, the fragmentation in our country, and how do we maintain the election integrity that's been so core to American values for centuries. So that, I think, we have a number of ideas on how to do that. And one thing that was lacking, and what I think is hopeful and promising, the one thing that was lacking, that was most problematic from my perspective, was this lack of a multi-party effort to maintain the election integrity. From Burundi to Kenya to Afghanistan, in countries where I was working on elections, you had key elders, political figures, community leaders, church leaders, global politicians and diplomats who were coming together to mediate the differences and talk about the lack of understanding and try to get to a place where there could be reduced violence, there could be an equitable political solution. We haven't seen that here, except the thing that is promising is that after the election, so AFSC is based in Philadelphia. That's where I lived for a long time. And in Philadelphia, though we all have a Democratic governor, we do have a Republican senator who's very aligned with Trump. And he, understanding the complex election mechanisms that we have to protect the vote, came out and said, all of the elected officials in Pennsylvania came out and said, no, the votes are secure. The votes are secure because everyday people were in there watching and challenging the polls. So I think that we need we need to take a look at our civic education system. We need education on what happens in elections, how everyday poll workers are engaged and protect the vote. We need a multi-party effort to look at early warnings, to look at how we got so close to violence, and how are we still at a place where 62% of the Trump voters, which is a very substantial portion of our country, they believe that fraud has happened, although there's no evidence that it happened. So there really needs to be an effort by Democrats, Republicans, independents, Green Party, every Democratic Socialist, a really collaborative effort to take a look at what happened and how do we modernize our election procedures so that this can never happen again and we can never get this close to potential violence.
Thanks, Carrie. One question that I wanted to ask you quickly, which is, if 20% of the Trump supporters have changed their minds, or slightly more, perhaps, a 17% drop, what do you think has generated that movement, and is there anything in that process that we could learn from?
Yeah, I do really think that it is people, election officials, crossing party lines to affirm the election integrity. I really believe, you saw in Georgia, Republican election officials coming out and saying how close that, the Secretary of State and election officials were being threatened with violence, and that he was a Republican supporter. And so when Democrats and Republicans are coming together to say, hey, everyday Americans were working for, nothing in the polls, all day long to protect your vote, and this is key to American democracy, that made a difference when you had people on both parties very explicitly stating, if there may be challenges and people have a right to appeal, the Trump administration has a right to pursue whatever legal challenges they want to pursue. However, there's no evidence of fraud, and we affirm the results in our county. And this goes from a county level to a state level to a country level. So I'm encouraged by what I see in the county and the state, and I have not been encouraged by what I see at a federal level in terms of a multi-party effort to come together to affirm the election. And I think that's what's missing. But we have our election officials that work at a local and state level to thank, I think, for that change.
So there are a couple of elements here that certainly fit within our peace building paradigm: denial and top-down problems, and for sure. So George, you've got a framework that's going to that is also going to be really constructive for this conversation. Why don't you go next?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of points really quickly. One is the Institute is about instinctive behavior, and we believe we are heavily driven by our instincts, and if we understand our instincts, then we can channel them, use them, have our cultures function in enlightened ways. And if we don't understand our instincts, they sweep us along, take us over, and drive us to bad places. And right now, we've got some very negative us-them tribal instincts being activated in the U.S. very deliberately, very intentionally, and very successfully. And that's an easy set of instincts to activate if you know what you're doing and you choose to go down those paths. So we've got those instincts activated. People, humans across the planet who have their alpha instincts activated, who become alpha, have an extremely hard time not being alpha. And so you never see a mayor who wants to leave being mayor. Religious leaders stay on for life. I mean, we really have a strong level of alpha instincts. It's very seductive. It's very rewarding. It's emotionally rewarding. And so people with those instincts activated become addicted to them, do not want to leave them, and will do things in their communities to create support for their alpha status. So if you understand the instincts, what's happening here, it makes perfect sense. I mean, just a normal pattern of alpha behavior attempting to stay in alpha position and in power. And as a people, we generally want to be at peace. We would rather be collectively at peace. And the election actually was an honest election. So part of the good news is over time, that's going to become increasingly clear. And as it becomes clear, people have an avenue to come back into being peaceful. And what I'm suggesting is once we become peaceful, what we need to do is a couple of things together to prove to each other that we care. And the first thing we need to do is help all our kids. Our kids are in terrible shape. Over 60% of the Medicaid kids in the country can't read. They basically can't do math. We will never ever change the earning gaps and the wealth gaps as long as we have people, the majority can't read. And what we know is the brain science of the first 3 years of life are when the neurons connect. And if you get to age 4, the brain actually changes. So if you haven't strengthened a child's brain with brain exercise before age 4, there's nothing you can do. After that, you can do nice and caring things for the kids, but you can't really make them better learners. And so the wealth gaps in America will never, ever be closed if the majority of people in those groups can't count or read. And we're not going to change. So we have to go upstream. So what we're trying to do is say, let's show good faith to everybody. Let's really show good intent. And then let's help every kid. If you go to 3keyyears.org, that's one of our websites. 3keyyears.org has brain science for families and kids about what you do in the first months and years of life to give kids strong brains. And we think that if we prove to every group that we want their kids to succeed, That'll be a good indication of peace. Second thing is we need better health care for everybody. We could be on the cusp of a golden age of healthcare with all the great tools. We spend more money than anybody in the world by a vast amount of money, and we should be getting great care for that money. And so one of the things we talked about at the Institute is basic things we can do to both create universal coverage and great care. And the work that we're doing in that space was just written up in Health Affairs. Harvard Business Review just did a piece on it, and Forbes magazine just did a positive piece. And so we're trying to say, if you use these tools, go to the website again, and you can read some of the information, because I think we need to cover everybody. We need everybody to have great care. And some of the people just want to cover everybody, but they don't know that great care is possible. And the third thing we need to do in every community is we need to understand us-them instincts. If somebody's an us, we're protective, we're supportive, we're nurturing. If somebody is a them, we're territorial, we distrust them, we antagonize them. And so we need to understand those instincts, and then we need to apply them to our police department. We need the police department in every city to be an us. We need to say, that is our goal. In every city, we want the city council, the leadership, the police department leadership, to figure out what it will take to have the people in this community believe and perceive that the police here are in us. And there's a number of things you can do. The solution's a little different in every community. But when you do that, people want the police to be on their side when they're being damaged or have bad things happening to them. People really want the police to be their friend. But we have to steer to that place in an intentional way, and also get the people in the community on board with that agenda and agree that the best outcome is to have the police be an us. And then the last thing that we're trying to encourage is truth. We think that we need truth to become a core American value again. It was for a long time. Telling the truth was something we took great pride in doing. Self-esteem was based on telling the truth. Sun Tzu in Art of War basically says, lie to the enemy, deceive the enemy, trick the enemy at all times. And we have gone down the Sun Tzu Art of War path, and we are telling lies to each other, misleading each other, and feel no guilt about it. And what we need to do is, instead of that, say, you know what, we want America to succeed. We want our kids and our grandkids to have a great future. And one of the things we need to do that is we need to each pledge. We're not going to debate the truth. We need to each pledge not to say anything that we know is not true at the time we say it. We need to self-police. We will not say, if we know something, if we learn something isn't true, we won't say it. And if we make that commitment to each other, that's very respectful. It's very collaborative. I've run half a dozen organizations, some with 200,000 employees. I've done that as an internal culture of telling the truth, and it's amazingly useful. So that's what we need. We need a truth agenda going forward. So we need a truth movement for America, and we need to self-police it.
George, thank you. Several things you said I'm going to use as, for the larger conversation. So we'll come back to you. And then George does have a booth as well that he's inviting people to join. And I think it's up in the chat. I saw that Erica has put something up there as well. So Prabha, I think that leads rather generously into your, George's call for truth, into your kind of sense of the American infrastructure for peace building in our country. So why don't you take over and use the next 3 to 4 or 5 minutes?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you listening in from other parts of the world. I am delighted to actually have this opportunity and want to thank AFP and USIP for giving me a chance to share what I think will tie together many of the things that Hamza and Kerry and George have talked about. And it's not 2 or 3 ideas, it's actually one idea. And this is a proposal that comes out of the work of the last few months of an extraordinary network of organizations, each of whom is in itself a network. So I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of individuals and organizations who came together to pull together the first early warning, early response platform in this country that was needed, as Kerry said. But that was the beginning, and out of that comes this recommendation that in order to diminish the divides we're talking about, to create community cohesion, and thereby increase the security of this democracy, we are proposing a national cohesion and security infrastructure. Now, this will have the capacity to address current and historical issues and apply the power of a wide range of democracy, governance, and peacebuilding tools, including police-community relationship building or transformation, in order to let the people generate and self-determine solutions. Those are the principles this country was founded on. This, we believe, was and remains the intent of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Section 10. So even as we propose a national infrastructure, I want to suggest that we don't have to build it, rebuild it. We don't have to pass legislation. We don't have to start commissions for it. The infrastructure support exists in existing legislation. So as a conflict analyst and as practitioners, what we know is that the divisiveness that we see has to be addressed in its root causes. Otherwise, as Hamza said, unless we make systemic changes, we will continue to see the kind of divisiveness and the responses instinctively, as George referred to, unless we address it at the core. So even as we recognize that the US has been and continues to be celebrated throughout the world as the first modern democracy, indeed the leading democracy, and the birthplace of movements that provide much needed rights to laborers, to women, people of color, and the LGBTQ plus community, we must also remember that its roots in a history of systemic violence, as well as abusive labor conditions, exist. That history continues to shape conflict dynamics and inequalities today. They cannot be addressed unless we do that in a systemic fashion. And that means system reform in health, education, housing, and all of the other systems that were mentioned. But I look at those three as the three most basic, in which the indigenous and African American community was impacted most deeply during our history of genocide and slavery. So with this commitment, I think we can build on the existing infrastructure. And what is the infrastructure I'm referring to? In 1964, the Civil Rights Act made possible a national network of community mediation centers. There are over 300 of them in this country today, and they exist in your community. They exist across the country in almost every state, and they have been working at the heart of community building for the last 50 years. They used to be called the Justice Centers in the South, and they used to be called community boards in the North. And these organizations are not as strong as they were because of the decline because of changes, and we can get into the details of that. But what I love is that we have them at the core. And they stepped forward as we formed this early warning, early response system, recognizing that we were, as Kerry said, for the first time in about 50 years, and I won't say in centuries, in about 50 years, threatened with extreme violence. And not only were we threatened, that continues. We are monitoring the threats of violence, and they continue. We will be continuing to monitor until Inauguration Day and beyond. But to come back to the rebuilding, all of what you have suggested requires local action. Long-term solutions are sustainable only when people trust each other and are directly involved and integrally a part of the process. And so we propose to the Biden-Harris administration and to all of US peace builders that you consider building on this infrastructure of community mediation centers being at the community level, convening all of the extraordinary growth of peace-building organizations that have developed in the last 40 years and use the peace-building tools that, as several others have referred to, that have been developed in the last 30 years. We have extraordinary tools and we have amazing resources in this country. Let's pull them together to accomplish what we need to.
Thanks very much, Prabha. One of the things that maybe you can do is if you could provide a link in the chat that's going on to some of these justice centers and community boards that you've mentioned. I think that would be, because I'm sure quite a few people are not as conversant with them as you are. And if that is a core resource, I'd like to start off by asking a question of each of you, and that is the threat of violence has been something that I think people, wherever they are in the political spectrum, have feared in this past in this recent period of American history. So wherever we may sit on the political spectrum, the expression of fear around political events has clearly been a major theme. And I wonder if you could offer, so that we bring policy and practice together as much as possible, sort of one idea that you have that kind of addresses this core threat of violence, or this core fear of violence, and how you're dealing with it, or how you would want to express a way to deal with it that we could take up as a society, as a practice in our society, rather than as a policy that is going to be pursued by our legislators or by our president-elect or whoever it happens to be. Is that fairly clear? Who seems to have the best? Who wants to jump in first? Just raise your hand like this, and we don't have to go in any order. Okay, Prabhat, you go first, and anybody else who'd like to jump in on that.
I'll be glad to, Rick, and thank you for asking that. You're absolutely right. This is not about what happens far away. What we are seeing is in each of our communities. This division is in our neighborhoods. The people we are referring to as armed groups now, because of the growing radicalization, are our PTA members. They come to our libraries, our churches, and our children go to school together. So I do think that we need to have these conversations in our own communities. It absolutely needs to begin at the community level, which is a tradition that we have had, that we have somehow, for a lot of good reasons, including that of the media and the use of social media and the disinformation campaigns that we heard so much about yesterday at one of the panels, have succumbed to the kind of tribalism that George referred to. So it certainly does require a different kind of education and a different kind of orientation on our parts to be responsive, to be able to listen, to have the kinds of dialogues that we need to, and to have the kinds of collaborative processes at the local level. Somebody had referred to the 75 million people. That is not a monolith. And one of the reasons I would suggest that there was a change is because they are individuals with a wide range of interests. Most of them are concerned. Most of them, I say, most of that 70 million, because I'm not one of them, are concerned about their children's future and about the economics of this country. Those are things we share. And so beginning with what we share can be extraordinarily impactful. I'll stop there.
Good. That's really a good piece of wisdom. Hamse, you're next. We've got you. Yeah, we got you muted still, Hamse. Okay, go. Now you're good.
Okay, all right. Yeah, we have a lot of existing resources that I'm not sure if we are fully utilizing. I was talking to a friend, a long-term American, resident, and I said, last 4 years, and especially last year and a half with the election, I feel like Americans, especially those on the left, got a small dose of what it feels like to live in unsafe, environment. I'm trying to be very diplomatic, but those of us who were complaining about what happens outside the U.S., living under autocracy, living under dictatorship, being victims of political violence at a young age, we were not alarmists in 2016, 2015 when we were saying, we're heading in the wrong direction. And I feel like those nuances and stories and experiences of Americans now, coming from origin countries where there was significant violence, political violence, and so forth. There's a lot of resources that we can tap into for the benefit of America now, and so I think those resources exist in every neighborhood as a melting pot with folks with diverse experiences, lived experiences, and professional experiences. So how do we tap into that? I think within our own communities. Secondly, I think again, it starts local. It starts at the local level. I feel like young people who would be inheriting the future often find themselves as subject of conversations rather than participants of conversations. And until we see young people as contributors and participants sitting at the table, I'm afraid we will not make significant progress. And so I just want to add by saying let's utilize all the existing tools within our toolbox we have, including expertise, lived experiences of diverse Americans who can benefit us move from where we are to a more peaceful, equitable world.
So I know that George and Carrie, you have things to say here as well, but maybe I can direct you a bit to some of the issues that are coming up in the chat room as well. George, you really talked about sort of a national truth serum process or vaccine or whatever it's going to be, and and there have been questions about the media and discussions the last day about disinformation and misinformation. And also comments about we've had this keeping it local phenomena. And I just wonder, one of my favorites is elevating the level of local news gathering, which is kind of a lost art. Local newspapers going out of business and whatnot. But I wonder if you, Carrie and George, have kind of favorite approaches or processes that you think will help to advance the truth agenda, the broader truth agenda, that might be locally driven, or can be individually owned, or that can require a bit more introspection on our part, because obviously most of the instincts that we're feeling are being felt by people who have very, very different political conclusions or visions. So either George or Carrie, do you want to jump in on this, George?
Yeah, I've actually gone to 40 countries and look at tribal behavior. We have 125 countries in the world right now where we are fighting each other as tribes. Iraq, totally tribal. Pick the country, Afghanistan. Those countries all have tribes fighting tribes. And once they start fighting each other, they hate each other, they detest each other, they firebomb each other. Once you get into that level of really antagonistic enemy thinking, you tend to stay there. I've gone to Northern Ireland. There's tribal behavior there people live in different communities with walls between them. So we live in a world where this is really bad. And we need to make sure that we don't get there here, because we are humans here with the same instincts that the rest of the world has. We can easily tribalize. We can easily go down those paths, and once we're there, stay there for generations. And so we're on the cusp of real danger here. And we have to create an American us. We have to return to a higher level of calling, a mission vision of America, and bring people together in that context, and then do things together, work together. We need team behaviors. We need to clean up communities. There's a whole series of things we can do, make our schools better. We can pick collective things that cause us to interact with people from the other group at a human level and rise to that level. Because if we don't do that, it is very, very tempting. And there's an entire commercial world out there that benefits from the division. So they have readers and they sell ads, and there's a market for tribal behavior. And what we need to do as individuals, we need to get smart people who care, religious leaders, people who care from community groups, who say we are going to rise to a higher level. We're going to have enlightened, inclusive behaviors. We're going to do win-win, and we're going to help each other. And telling the truth is not something we enforce on people, but that we commit to ourselves, that we will ourselves agree to tell the truth. And then we will ask other people in our family, in our group, to tell the truth, but make telling the truth a behavior pattern and a culture and an expectation. And we were there at one time, we can return there, but we're not going to get there accidentally.
Great, Carrie.
Well, I agree with all the points that have been made. And as somebody who's run for office, local office, and as a peace builder in a very small divided town that's a lovely little beachside hamlet and becomes very aggressive and ugly when the elections come up, I do think we need more efforts at a local community to have these conversations in civilized, humanized ways, because we know violence occurs when we're not humanizing each other. And, I can have a neighbor who really disagrees with all of my politics and can write very mean things about me on Facebook, but still will be helpful when a tree falls down in my front yard. So how do we really build on that humanizing? How do we build our humanity? How do we have collective experiences as neighbors? And I will say, as somebody who does think that we need more diversity and representation in politics, everyone on this call should run for office at a local level, at a federal level. If you're not engaged in some kind of position in your community, we need you, because that will make a difference. We need people who are bringing peace building lenses to their communities that can really start to try to integrate the ideas that we need to be one. We are one country, and we really need to find our commonality and to have conversations while addressing those root causes of horizontal inequality, systemic oppression, and violence that exist. We need to look that straight on and address that, but we also need to humanize each other.
Thanks very much, Carrie. And I follow up on that, because in the last couple of years, I had a chance to travel all over the United States talking about my book, and I've oftentimes got asked, it's nice to talk about Syria and Bosnia, or whatever you want to talk about, but we've got this problem here. And I would ask almost every audience that I met with, I'd say, how many of you have had a real political conversation with somebody who has an opposing point of view in the last year? And you cannot count a family gathering as an example, because everybody's got at least one family member who doesn't agree with them. And it turned out that very few people could really raise their hands. And this was in a group of people who were quite so. So I guess my great grandfather would say that the human stomach can digest anything except for introspection. And so I wonder if each of you could express a personal story, tell us a personal case where you've really either had sought out somebody who you knew had an aggressively different position than you, or would be even more telling, where your position has actually changed or altered a little bit as a result of an exchange. Because it's easy for us to say we're going to do this for everybody else, but if we're incapable of doing it, why would they be more capable than we are? So, who would like to start on that one? Yeah, Hamsi.
I'll be quick. So a friend of mine, 2016 Trump supporter. Our friendship was impacted by the election, and about a year and a half ago, my friend who has a transportation business reached out to me and we had a long conversation where he said, I came to apologize that, my vote in support was based on Obamacare, against Obamacare, and, I saw my tax, increase, and so economic, reason. But he said, just what's been happening in the last few years has made me feel terrible that I'm in this intermediate and people like yourself. And I developed, this strong anti-Somali sentiment in our state. And he said it's because it's around my community, it's in my house, and what can we do together to address that? We are adamantly against the views that, for transparency, he said, people like crazy left like you believe in, but I don't want to disintermediate your humanity. And so that led us to have an intense conversation. Supposedly, I was gonna join Thanksgiving dinner at his house. That didn't happen because of COVID. But it was really profound conversation that also I deeply realized that my narrative and approach was also one of adversarial in response to him, and that, while I don't believe in the economic reason of support, there is a place that we can agree on, that, building up our humanity and our existence. I fled war, as a tender age of my teens. Last thing I want is violence, and so I think through that conversation, I can see potential work, in the coming, year for both of us to build more peaceful Minnesota.
Great.
We have
George, go ahead. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so this is going to be everybody's kind of last word as well. So George, just
sure.
Understand we've got each have about a minute to wrap.
Okay. We need to have people do things together with each other to overcome differences. That is one of the most powerful. We have very strong team instincts. We will organize the team across all boundaries. And if we function as a team, then we can use the context of being a team to overcome other differences. My last company, we had 200,000 employees. We were 59% minority. We had 140,000 people on unit-based teams. And the morale of the people on the teams across all races, ethnicities, was much higher, and they worked better with each other because of the team behavior. So we need to figure out things to do in communities that we can do as teams to get to know each other as people.
Great, thank you. That's really excellent. Prabha, and then we'll give Carrie the last word.
Wonderful. We do. And I'll tell you, as an example, my dog walking group. I walk on the weekends with a group of people. And it was over these elections. It's actually several months. And I seek that kind of conversation because part of what we need to also be is curious. We have to develop the capacity for curiosity. I'm a child development specialist. I understand when George talks about brain development in the first 3 years, that's a critical stage. There's no question about it. But we have to maintain our curiosity. Why do you believe what you do? Oh, I saw this result on the internet. Tell me a little bit more about what sources they were. Why did you believe that? So I stay in conversation with people who believe that our elections were stolen, who believe that there was fraud, and we continue. What we have committed, though, is to being curious about each other's positions. And that is exactly what we can do at the local level and nationally. So I cannot end without saying, go to the Trust Network website. You will see a network of organizations that have the skills and the tools to facilitate the kinds of dialogues we are talking about, to facilitate the kind of collaborative processes that we are talking about, because it has to happen at the local level. And I don't think we have a choice but to be collaborative. And that begins in our communities.
Great, thanks. And let's make sure that link is up there. I think that Chip and others have chimed in, but let's make sure there's a live link to what you just suggested, Prabha, on the chat and the chat function. Thank you so much. That's really excellent. Carrie, you get the last word, although I'm going to actually steal the last word.
Oh, of course. Well, Prabha, and AFSC is part of the Trust Network, and we've been really happy with the value that the network has added. So that's been wonderful. So I would say that, we should try to emulate the foundations of AFSC's Quakerism and really try to see the humanity and that of God in everybody. And if you can try to see the light in somebody that's next to you, in your neighbor. When I ran for office, I had really, and in my little community, I have conversations with people who really violently disagree with my positions and try to keep my center and, stand for rights and not be unbending on rights and being against systemic violence, but really being able to see, understand, be curious about where they're coming from, understand their concerns, try to find some common ground. We all care about our children's education and future. How can we get to some common space and really continue to speak? Because we live in segregated communities. In the media, we're moving to spaces where we're not engaging with people that have different political experiences than us more and more. And how do we prevent that? We're going to become more polarized in the next decades if we don't address that problem.
Well, there are plenty of opportunities. Thank you all very much. Really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And thanks to the Alliance for this spectacular 3-day gathering of people and of ideas and of challenges that we all need to face better. I'd like to just close by quoting something that Hamse said in his book, which was, I think, a good uplifting message. He's had to live it. Some of us have started on second or third base while he was learning about baseball, let alone whether he had an advantage in the game. And he basically says, reach out, understand, and explore how best to live as one equal and prosperous society. I think that's really our ambition. It's one that we should hold, and I think it's one that all of you have brought great wisdom to this early morning conversation. Thank you so much. I hope that the 80 plus people that have joined us during this session will stay on for the next series of panels and conversations. They've all been really enriching. I've only been able to do one every hour, so have missed several other good ones. But thank you all. It's been really a pleasure to work with you. And thank you to those who were listening and sharing your questions and comments. Have a great day. Bye-bye. I will stay on for anybody who'd like to converse. If there's anybody, any other questions that you want to send in on the panel, I'll try it. It looks like some of the other panelists may stay with us, but they're not obliged to. They all have lives. We've gotten quite a few thanks. I don't know if you've all had a chance to follow the chats, but I think there have been some good ones. I do think we got a little bit to make sure we weren't just in our own bubble talking to ourselves. Thank you for those comments. Carrie, I ran for office when I was a little younger than you. And,
I look young.
And I look really young. I mean, I like to think that's the reason I didn't win. That people didn't think I had topped the constitutional age barrier of being 25, because I grew sideburns so I would look older.
But that's so funny.
It took so long for them to grow that it didn't convince people.
Funny.
Yeah, but it's a big experience.
And now I have I have 2 PACs to support women to run for office, but it is a big experience. And, in this little town to get, I had net flyers about, with demonizing me because of sanctuary positions and then have to have conversations about it. It breaks through, I find it to be a very humanizing, it's such a growth a place where you can grow as a person and as a policymaker and as a professional. And I want everyone to run for office.
Probably can't hear you. You're muted right now. No, you're good. You're good now. Maybe I'm controlling it. I don't.
Well, there are two peace builders I have met who have used that framework as they ran for office, and you might know both of them. Well, one, Jane Doherty at EMU is doing some amazing work, and
yes, I know Jane. Yes, definitely.
And the other is it Shank is the last name? Ran in Vermont. He's on the Carter School of Conflict Resolutions Advisory Board with me, and really had an amazing story of how he used peace-building principles for his entire campaign.
Oh, and wonderful.
So I'll see if I can connect you. No, are you
great?
Where in your run for office are you, Kerry?
Oh, so I ran for a council in this town, for a local council, lost. There was a Republican sweep, but was appointed. So I served for council, and I have two PACs, one called Represent, that I founded in Philadelphia to support women at a federal and local level, and just founded Elect Women New Jersey to fund women at a local level in New Jersey. So I'm focused on, on funding women to run. But I was asked to run, 3 months before I moved to the town, like a year before. So all these flyers came about the radical big city interloper who came to change this little town's views. But it was a wonderful thing, and I really do. I will likely run again at a different level in the future.
So I'm happy to let me know when I've spent my 10,000 plus hours in that space, so I can I don't charge the way political consultants do, so it could save you a lot, and you can be more creative. Polly Byers asked us, do we have more examples like the Paula Green example of Hands Across the Hills that we could share? Mm-hmm. Do either of you have any ideas that come to mind that there's still 30 plus people on the line, it seems, or maybe
Well, actually, sorry, go ahead, Kerry.
No, go ahead. I'm trying to think of a Quaker listening project that we've done a while ago, but go ahead, and I'm going to try to pull it up.
Well, there are actually hundreds of dialogues. Hundreds of them that individuals and organizations are facilitating across the country. If you look at Days of Dialogue in LA, there is one that is about police community relationships, and they have a variety of topics. Many of the AFP members who are local peace builders are holding dialogues around race relations. There are many in the Mediators Beyond Borders community who are holding dialogues about race and faith. Urban-rural divisions, that's a big one in this country that doesn't get talked about as much. I mean, if you look at a lot of the conversations, and what is great is that as we have all adapted to COVID and started using online platforms, it has also become possible to bring people across these divides together in these kinds of spaces. So I would say look at the network partners, and there are lots of organizations facilitating these kinds of dialogues with the intent of promoting understanding and relationship. And that's why I think building that trust deposit back is so critical.
And I think that, in addition to the dialogues, George, why don't you jump in? In addition to dialogues, I mean, there are obviously lots and lots and lots of initiatives around, reforming an actual school, or the citizen review of the police department, whatever. So, or building a new footbridge across a railroad path. I mean, there's literally America is so enriched by these millions of local initiatives that require good dialogue before people decide what to do. But they're also oftentimes motivated by an action. George, do you want to jump there?
Braver Angels. I don't know if you've heard of the Braver Angels group, but they do a really, really good job. They bring people together in hundreds of communities, and you get reds and blues together in the room. They try to have 10 of each, 12 of each or something. And then they spend hours and hours and hours talking about common values, common approaches, and doing some healing and building. A good group, actually started by a University of Minnesota professor and some people down in LA who were peace people from LA. And they really do a nice healing job. Braver angels or better angels is worth it. I've attended several of their sessions virtually, and they've been amazingly good, because to hear the people on both sides speak their mind is stunningly useful.
Yeah, that's such an opening. I don't want to. I think we've answered not only Paulie's request, but I think Amber Lewis was looking for some of the same kind of stuff. I'm a bit hesitant to go on, because I think we're competing now with other PeaceCon events, and so. But you can find George at his during any of the breaks, and please feel free to send emails to any of the rest of us if you'd like. Thank you all again, and thanks Carrie and Prabha and obviously George and Hamse as well. So really great to have you be part of this. Thanks so much. I'll say goodbye.
Thanks, Eric. Yep, great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prabha. Good to see you.
Lovely to see you.